Good morning. We are going to get started on the next session, which is entitled Democracy When People Are Thinking. I'd like to remind everyone you're at the Hannah Arendt Conference. There are no dangerous thoughts. Thinking itself is dangerous. It is my great pleasure to be able to introduce our next speaker, but I wanted to say a few things first. I'm not sure how many of you get news alerts on your phones. I know that I get breaking news alerts on my phone all the time, and if you're like me, you might be slightly overwhelmed by the frequency of breaking news that makes your heart skip a beat these days. And it sort of feels post-election that we're living in a new time, a time that calls for active participation, a renewal, if you will. And I think one of the more encouraging things that we have seen is we've seen a revival in town halls and in civic participation across the country. I think this is something that has at least forced some of our elected officials to if not respond, then acknowledge the will of the people and public opinion in a new way that we really haven't seen in many years. And so I think what is so exciting about our next speaker is that he has been working around this question and has been thinking about how you accurately represent the will of the people or public opinion, and what it would look like if we did that sort of on the front end of policymaking rather than on the back end in a sense, a reaction to policy that's already been formed. So it's my great honor to introduce James Fishkin, who has spent a lot of time working on an answer to this question. James Fishkin holds the Janet M. Peck Chair in International Communications at Stanford University, where he is also a professor of communication. He is the director of the Center for Deliberative Democracy. The center is devoted to research about democracy and public opinion that's obtained through deliberative polling. Professor Fishkin first proposed deliberative polling as a method of public consultation in 1988. It's since been applied to more than 24 countries around the world. He has written that deliberative polls can produce mutual understanding in such cases of sharp ethic and political conflicts. It can even transcend linguistic divides. So please help me in welcoming James Fishkin to the Hannah Arendt Center.
Well, thank you so much for the very thoughtful introduction. Of all the introductions I've ever received, that is the most recent. But it is also one that I very much appreciate. And this conference has immersed us all in the problems of democracy. Let me just make sure the clicker does not work. So I'm going to speak for a little bit while he fixes it. That was my, the conference has immersed us in the problems of democracy. We first have to ask, some people think we need more democracy, some people think we need less democracy. I think we first need to raise the question, what kind of democracy? This works now? Okay. So, I want to say, to simplify a vast discussion, I want to say you can boil it down to 4 kinds of democracy. 3 of them we use in different combinations in different countries of the world or at different times. And the 4th one is sort of lost in the dust of history. I thought that I had reinvented or invented the 4th one, but in fact, it goes back to ancient Athens. But some practices in ancient Athens that Madison, who Ude Mehta quoted Federalist 55, Madison was talking about the assembly. But the really interesting part for me of ancient Athens was not the assembly, and I'll get to that. It was in some other institutions, which can be revived using modern social science to do them in the best way. can be revived as a partial remedy for the many problems. I won't say it's a complete solution, but it's a partial remedy, and I even have a scenario for scaling it with modern technology that could make it an even better remedy. But first I want to describe what we've done in 107 cases in now 27 countries around the world. I have to update our website, and I'll describe the practice. So I don't want to be too mysterious, and I'm going to zip through a lot of slides. Some of them you may only see for a nanosecond, because I want to cover the important ones, and I know I don't have much time. So this slide, which is rather daunting, just think about 4 kinds of democracy: competitive democracy, elite deliberation, participatory democracy, and what I'm calling deliberative democracy. Deliberative democracy is the solution that I want to talk about. Competitive democracy, these are the values emphasized. The competitive democracy, Joseph Schumpeter said, democracy is just the competitive struggle for the people's vote. Whoever wins, wins. We have some maybe constitutional protections against tyranny of the majority, but basically we don't expect really a will of the people, according to Schumpeter, who was the great theorist of the kind of democracy that we have now, in that campaigns want to win. Parties want to win. They don't want to, more important than making the best argument is getting the most votes. And unfortunately, that creates incentives to manipulate, mislead, do whatever is possible to win. It's a fortunate accident when it turns out that the party making the best argument wins the election. We would like a kind of democracy where that is the case, and that is a direction for democratic reform. And we've all become aware of fake news and all kinds of distortions as well in the modern environment. I just want to point out before I go further that the pointer doesn't work, but well, anyway, the second column, elite, I call it elite deliberation. Remember, when Madison conceived of the strategy for the American Constitution, he did not envisage political parties. They would be factions. He envisaged rather a process of indirect filtration. Representatives, as he said in Federalist 10, were to refine and enlarge the public views by passing them through the medium of a chosen body of citizens. The senators were indirectly elected. The Constitutional Convention was indirectly elected. The state ratifying conventions were. Even the Electoral College was supposed to originally be a deliberative institution. So we have the leftover of this different notion of democracy, where the most capable people were supposed to think about the public interest. And the cool and deliberate sense of the people would govern, as he said in Federalist 63. Well, that has all changed. That whole design has changed. Okay, well then, think of participatory democracy. Participatory democracy showed itself in the Rhode Island referendum, which voted down the Constitution when they were asked to. Nobody studies that in high school anymore, but participatory democracy has been taken up by the progressives. I live in California, primary, referendum, recall. Since 1911, we have direct voting all the time. The one that I'm going to focus on is deliberative democracy by the people themselves, which sort of got lost in the dust of history. I'm just going to skip this stuff because I'm going to run out of time. There are some. What I call deliberative democracy, let me just describe it. I've skipped a bunch of slides already. The Athenians had an institution where they would randomly select. They used this machine. That's a photo I took in the Museum of the Forum in Athens. it's only half of the machine, but it was called the Clarotarian, Kleroterion. The Clarotarian was a random sampling machine. They would randomly select 500 citizens who were the Council of 500, who would select the agenda for the assembly. Then they would also randomly select the jurors in the courts with the same machine. They also used that machine. You have to look it up. It's a little bit of a Rube Goldberg contraption. Look it up online to see how it works. There's some illustrations because a lot of it was wood that is no longer available. But the random samples would deliberate, setting the agenda. If someone made an illegal proposal in the assembly, they could be prosecuted by something called the Graphe Paranomen, which was another random sample of 500 who would consider whether the proposal was completely irresponsible. Most interesting to me, after the Athenians were goaded into the Peloponnesian War and lost against Sparta, when they reconstructed their democracy, they said, we need something to protect us from the orators whipping up the passions of the people, basically protect us from populism, we would say now. And they created legislative commissions, nomothetai they were called, where the random sample, where if something passed the assembly, it didn't become a law, it was a proposal. Then they prepared like a court case, the case for and the case against, and then the people would, a random sample of 500 selected by this machine would vote up or down after it heard all the arguments. That was to protect them from the passions of the people and to make a deliberative decision. Now let me go back. So what I have done for the last 20 years is apply a version of this notion, but perfected with modern social science. We take random samples of the public. First, we engage an advisory group that represents the different views on the issues in depth. There's some issue to be decided. The arguments for and against, they vet it for balance and accuracy. Then we construct a questionnaire. I say we, there are always local collaborators in the various countries. Sometimes the government is sponsoring it, sometimes the civil society, whatever. And then we recruit the best possible sample that we can get, random sampling, and then we bring them together. By the way, we also have an online version with good samples as well, using Google Hangouts and video and voice. But we recruit them, we bring them together. So we put the whole country in one room, in effect, in microcosm, to deliberate in depth with moderated small groups. And after maybe 2 days, 3 days of deliberation, where they ask questions to competing experts and they really probe the issue in depth and decide what they say, they take the same questionnaire. Those results then become impactful for decisions. Often there's a television program and other social media and the rest of it, but it becomes an important decision. This very weekend, I almost didn't come because South Korea is doing a deliberative poll. One of my former students now at Seoul National University is involved in it, about whether to close 2 nuclear reactors that they've spent a lot of money on, but that were started by the previous government, and the current government is not so interested in nuclear power. In 3 weeks, I go to Malawi. 2 weeks, I go to Malawi to report the results of one of our African deliberative polls. People had said, you can't do this if the population is not literate. Malawi happens to be the poorest country in Africa, and the region of Malawi where we did this, the people cannot really read. Nevertheless, we adopted it with video briefings and oral interviews, and the people of Malawi came to very thoughtful, considered judgments about what needed to be done, about some difficult issues. I'll explain. But there's a big movement in political science today to say that the problems of democracy are because the people are incompetent. Chris Aiken and Larry Bartels have this book, Democracy for Realists, that is sweeping the political science profession, saying basically the people are incompetent, and it's a mythical or folk theory to think that the people can exert any popular control. I disagree strongly. My view is that the people are very smart. You just have to engage them in conditions where they can listen to each other in a civil way, they can get good information, and they can spend the time and attention to really get involved. Most of the time, the public is not involved and not well informed because of a widely accepted social science explanation that Anthony Downs formulated in 1957. It's called rational ignorance. If I have one vote in millions, why should I pay a lot of attention? I've got other things to do. I have to provide for my family. I have to do my job. These are things where I can make a difference. So the policy about even if I care about the reform of the healthcare system, I nevertheless may not be able to do much about it as an individual. Would that it were otherwise, in the sense that it would be great if individual citizens thought they had a real stake in the issues and would spend the time and attention to think about it. I won't show the video, but this is from the very first deliberative poll, which was in 1994 in the United Kingdom, broadcast by Channel 4, and which I did with my British collaborators. And a couple of interesting things about that. In that, we had a national sample. It was about 300 people. We interviewed 800 people. There was very good response rate, especially by current standards. We interviewed 800 people. 300 came, but when we compared the 300 to the 500 who didn't come in attitudes and demographics, it was almost a perfect microcosm of Britain. A woman came up to me at that point. It was a weekend in the Granada television studios, and a woman came up to me and she said she wanted to thank me. And I said, why? And she said, well, she was a spouse accompanying her husband. The spouses could come on the buses where they came, but she couldn't participate. Only the people who were randomly selected could participate. And she said she wanted to thank me because in 30 years of marriage, her husband had never read a newspaper. And now, once he was invited to this, he'd started to read every newspaper every day, she said, and he was going to be much more interesting to live with in retirement. Well, for me, this encapsulated the fact that we had created incentives that overcame rational ignorance. He knew that he was going to have to talk for a whole weekend about the issue. And he knew that his voice would matter. After all, it was going to be broadcast on television. And indeed, Tony Blair was one of the experts who responded. We had in the process. And so now, the second thing that happened there, which I learned from, and this was the very first case out of 107 now, was I was listening to one of the small groups. The issue was crime and criminal justice policy. And I was listening to this small group, and I had thought, if you have a really good sample, you'll have everybody represented. We had criminals in the sample. And of course we did, because they turned up in the sample. They weren't recruited as criminals, they were just recruited. And so I was listening to this guy, and he was a car thief. And it was a tribute to the civility of the discussion that he could admit that he had been a car, he said he had been a car thief. But the way he talked about had been made us all wonder. Nevertheless, he added tremendously to the discussion in sort of filling out the idea that he had experience about what people are thinking about when they commit crimes. It was all confirmed by the criminologists and sociologists on the expert panels, who didn't give speeches, by the way. They only responded to questions from the small groups. So I learned that the diversity of a random sample brings tremendous intellectual resources if you can properly harvest them in making a decision. So we've even done this in China. That's the first Chinese deliberative poll. There have been several now. It's actually been praised at the highest level from the 18th Party Congress, and there are more Chinese deliberative polls, but only for local decision-making, issues of budget and infrastructure at the local level. Although we did one in Macau, all of these things are on the Center for Deliberative Democracy website, and they are all included in my new book, which will be out in a few months, called Democracy When the People Are Thinking. With Oxford University Press. But the Chinese ones showed that the local leaders were out of touch with the people. The local leaders thought the people would want, among the infrastructure projects, they thought they would want the image projects that showed how fast the town was growing. What they really wanted was clean water. They wanted sewage treatment plants. They wanted a comprehensive environmental plan. And they got all of those things. So my friend Mr. Zhang, who had the courage to do the first deliberative poll in China, now there have been many more, including one recently in a sub-district of Shanghai, he became famous on the internet, and they had to reward him. And he was even sent to America to learn English, and he came to visit me speaking English. I was very surprised. But that's the first. You can do this at the small scale, you can do this at the large scale. That's a picture of the European Parliament, but that is the first European-wide deliberative poll, which we did in 2007. That's the sample of Europe collected by TNS, and it was an excellent sample, and they spoke to each other in 22 languages through headphones, actually 21, because none of the Irish wanted to speak Gaelic. They all spoke English. And we did it. Was so successful, we did it again in 2009. And now I have an op-ed in Le Monde last week because we're trying to say that President Macron's idea that there should be a European-wide dialogue could best be instituted by this. My French partners are pressing that, and hopefully we will do another European-wide deliberative poll. Okay. We returned the Greek idea to Athens. That's Papandreou there, who was at one point prime minister, and he used it for candidate selection. And he wrote a wonderful op-ed about it in the what was then the International Herald Tribune. It can be used for candidates, it can be used for policies. We've used it in the US on a national basis. Let me say a word or two about Japan. We've done more in Japan than any other country. 2011, it was used. The DPJ government was about to privatize the pension system. We did a national deliberative poll, and they were calling the privatization of the pension system along the Chilean model, they were calling it the funded system, and it got about 70% in most polls. In our initial survey, it also got about 70%. But when people discussed it and they understood the risks of putting their pensions in the stock market, it went down to 35%. And instead, what the people of Japan really wanted was something safe and sure, but that would also, they were willing to pay more so long as the money went only for the pension system. So they approved an increase in the consumption tax. And that's exactly what the DPJ government and then the Abe government, the LDP government, has done. They followed the intellectual route that was laid out in the deliberative poll. And also the next year, the Japanese government commissioned the national deliberation on what to do after Fukushima. But I don't have time to go into that. Let me go on. How much time do I have? 5 minutes. Huh? All right. We used it in Texas in 8 projects that ended up with the Public Utility Commission taking Texas from being number 50 out of 50 states, that is last in the amount of wind power, to now being number 1 out of 50 states in the amount of wind power, because the public was willing to pay a little bit more to subsidize wind power. And that has turned out to be a great investment. I'll skip Brazil, China. We've been doing them in Africa. Let me just mention two projects. Africa, this is Ghana. That map is a map of all the, this is the northern city of Tamale. That map is a map of all the vegetable gardens and all the public latrines, because most people do not have a toilet in their dwelling. And as you'll see, it's the same map. The people were using the untreated wastewater for gardening, and this posed health risks. The big issue in Tamale was disease versus food security. And on a whole bunch, on 39 policy issues, they always sided with protect us from the disease and we'll figure out the food security. And these have now been presented to the Municipal Assembly, and we think that there was a big move in favor of banning the use of untreated wastewater, but also in favor of various ways of filtering the wastewater so that it can be more or less safe for gardening, and various ways of rainwater harvesting and other things that will solve the problem. So we think we've made a big contribution in the city of Tamale, which is a city of about 500,000 people. Let me tell you about Mongolia. We did a citywide project, which I'll skip, but here's what I really want to tell you about. Mongolia, you know, is a competitive democracy, and it's a democracy where there are wild swings between the two major parties. And the mayor of Ulaanbaatar came to see me, and he said that we have a democracy where we have extreme polarization and partisanship. We have a lot of fake news, or he didn't use the word fake news. We have a lot of misleading information spread on social media. We have a tabloid news agenda. We have a lot of cynicism about our politics. Have you ever heard of a country like that? And so I said yes, and he said, what would you do about it? I said, well, I would do deliberative polling. And what has happened in Mongolia is, after the first very successful project, all of which was implemented in the city of Ulaanbaatar, there was a coalition across both parties that created a law on deliberative polling, which I'm actually reprinting in the appendix to my book. The law on deliberative polling requires deliberative polling before the country can consider a constitutional amendment. And so then, a few months ago, in April, we helped the National Statistical Office of Mongolia conduct a national deliberative poll about various constitutional amendment proposals proposed by either party. And that is a sample of about 700 people. And let me tell you about that sample so you understand what's so important about getting a good sample. That sample, there were a random sample of households, random sample in the households. The same government agency that does the census did this. And of course, you've got yurts and the ger areas. You've got all kinds. Nevertheless, it was as a state-of-the-art sample, and we had about 700 people from whom invitations were offered, and another 700 who took the elaborate survey, and that was just for comparison purposes to establish just how representative the participants would be. But it turned out almost every single person who was contacted for the interview took the interview, and almost every single person who was invited came. And so that's the nearly 700, 695 or something. And then there are a few ringers. There are two members of my staff, and there's a very well-known American academic named Larry Lessig from Harvard, who is in the back row. We're in the very back row. In other words, there's a few members of the advisory group in the front, including the chief monk of the country and a few other distinguished notables. And the rest of it is this scientific sample. And of course, these other people, these ringers like myself, we were not part of the deliberations. We were just observing. So this is an almost perfect microcosm of the country. And what happened? One of the parties had the proposal that they really needed a second chamber, and a second chamber on the model of their 1990 Constitution. For various, I think I can comment now, very thoughtful reasons, that model of a second chamber went way down from 60-some% to 30% or something in the deliberation. The other party wanted to have an indirect election of the president, because right now the president is popularly elected. That also went way down. But there were various other proposals, including especially proposals that would fight corruption and create transparency, that were very high at the beginning and stayed high and went even higher. And then there was one particular problem that the prime minister can't even appoint or fire the members of his own cabinet, and it was to change that. And the anti-corruption proposals, some of them will seem bizarre. For example, it was that the names of the ministries should be in the Constitution. Well, that seemed bizarre to me until it was explained that what happens as one party comes in and the other party goes out, what they do is they change the name of the ministry and then they fire all the civil servants and hire new ones. So if you can't change the name of the ministry, you can't fire all the civil servants. So that was a creative solution to that. So right now, I'm going to get an update tomorrow night, but right now the Parliament is considering passing this constitutional amendment, which gets rid of the two big proposals from either party and is entirely focused on ways of fighting corruption, protecting the independent judiciary, and also has the reform on the powers of the prime minister. And my latest reports are I'm pretty optimistic, but we will see. And this will be the first time, this is by law, that the process will have been succeeded in creating an amendment, and I've got too much here, but let me just stop with this last thing, because so we've done 107 projects, 27 countries, and we will do Macedonia at the end of, just before Thanksgiving. We're doing Macedonia with Macedonian partners who are going to convene a national deliberative poll about whether Macedonia should join the EU and all the issues attendant to that. So I'll be there in Macedonia. And as I say, I have to go to Malawi to present the results of that one. So there will be 28. Now, but in all of these places, people say, why not just have a referendum? Well, we've already heard about the limitations of a referendum. I want a democracy where the people are thinking. And very often those, as you can see from these results, those results are quite different when people really engage with the issues. However, it would be politically more potent if the process could be scaled. So what I'm working on now with various collaborators, and I wrote a book about this with Bruce Ackerman in 2004, it was called Deliberation Day, but I think social media will make it more practical. The idea is the real experience of deliberation is not to experience the whole diversity of a random sample of the country. No person can do that, but you can have a civil conversation that is substantive and evidence-based with diverse others, moderated discussion. So we had the idea of spreading the exact process of deliberative polling with small groups and questions to competing experts, spreading it to millions of people. It may sound fanciful, but we actually worked out the budget for doing it face-to-face. But we've been doing online deliberative polls now for a number of years using Google Hangouts, and it works great online. Google Hangouts or some other video with the small group discussions and with a good sample. Suppose we set the issue of the sample aside and just imagine most everybody deliberating. Think for a moment how that would transform our politics. Think how it would transform in anticipation what reasonable candidates could say because they would know that people would have this extended discussion. So my idea is let's think about social media being used to stream into small groups with some algorithms, Republicans, independents, and Democrats into the same small groups that are moderated, and make it a big event that happens on successive weekends preceding a national election. We have found that even people who feel intensely when they come into discussion with diverse others in a moderated setting, often moderate their views and inform others and participate properly. We've done projects in Northern Ireland between Protestants and Catholics, and in Bulgaria on the issue of the Roma, which was highly intense. We've had great success with that. And I can push it one step farther, because this, I don't know if it will work, but this is really wild. I have a grant which I'm with a group of computer scientists and engineers at Stanford, where we're going to do this. We're experimenting with an automated moderator, a bot, but an automated moderator, because our moderators do not offer any information. They only say, make sure that it's a relatively equal discussion, and if we had small groups where people could trigger when somebody was being uncivil, and make sure that all aspects of the issues were discussed. There are various ways we actually have a partial prototype now. And the idea eventually would be to spread this to millions of small groups with an automated moderator. Now, I don't know if the automated moderator will work, but we'll test it and we'll improve it. And someday it will work. Maybe longer, it may take longer than our grant will last, but someday it will work. And then we would have a tool, when there's enough public interest, to spread Deliberation Day to millions of people. And we find that when people deliberate, there are all kinds of good effects on their sense of their role as citizens. And they acquire mutual respect even for the people they strongly disagree with. And this can surely do us some good in this current environment. Okay, that's all I have to say. Thank you.
So we are going to start the question and answer portion of this section. And I ask, like we did in the previous section, that if you have a question when you are called on, that you please stand up and state your question, since we are limited on time. I'm going to take the privilege of the moderator and ask the very first question. Here in the United States of America, there are things that have been polled on. Now, these are more general polls. It's not deliberative polling. But for instance, say Gallup, and we'll take gun control. There is a very large number of Americans, a majority of Americans, who agree that some sort of gun control would be beneficial for the country, and yet for years there has been no action by the federal government to change this. So my question to you is, it seems as though where deliberative polling has happened, there's been a will, a political will, in order to change something or to have the laws that are enacted reflect the policy and the will of the people. And what would you suggest here in the United States of America if you don't have, you have these things where people do agree, but you don't have, say, the political will in order to get them done? What would you suggest is the connecting between the two?
Well, does this work? I think gun control is a good example of my teacher, Robert Dahl at Yale, pointed out that we don't have a system of majority rule. We have a system of what he called minorities rule. Intense minorities for whom an issue is the voting issue will often determine the result. Nevertheless, we have found on very conflictual issues, it's possible with enough deliberation and enough initial spade work about possible alternatives and refinements to clarify what people would buy into from whatever point of view if they really thought about it, and the reasons why they would. And that can be useful in a stage of reform. And I think the Bulgarian case on the Roma, where it looked absolutely insoluble, was a good case, although there were a number of other factors that led to. The Roma schools are now desegregated, but it was thought impossible at the time that we did the project. But I think that the reasons why people support, I think it could be useful. But gun control is a very difficult one. We're talking to, we're planning with a university in Texas to do something on sanctuary cities, which I think will also be a very contested issue in the next few months. So I don't want to say which university because we haven't released it to the press yet, but that is in the works. So I think that on many difficult issues, it's possible to get that the deliberative conclusions of the people, because we get actual results and the reasons for them clarified, could play a role. But of course, we have this system in the U.S. which was famously designed to make it difficult to pass new measures. It's bicameral. We've got many veto points, and sometimes those veto points serve a value that I put up there that you may not have noticed called non-tyranny or tyranny of the majority, but sometimes those the veto points are good at preventing new legislation. And that can be good if it's really bad legislation, but it can be bad if something is urgently needed and has to be responded to. So I think we could do some useful things in the U.S. We had a big project in California that played a role in clarifying some modest reforms of the initiative system, and I think it could, this was in just a few years ago, and I think we could do some more things on contested issues. But you've picked a really good case. I'm not saying, I view the deliberative polling as a constructive remedy, not an all-purpose solution for everything, but I think it's something that has to be added to the toolkit as well as in addition to the other three forms of democratic practice that I identified.
Wonderful. Thank you. Are there questions? Yes.
Hi. I was wondering...
I think we have a mic coming to you if you just wait for a second.
Hi. So you said people reach thoughtful, considered judgments, right? And I was wondering whether this has to do, I mean, both, right? Certainly the process seems to be educative. Can you hear me? But I was wondering whether this has to do with more knowledge, and if what is balanced information, or whether this has to do more with the chance of getting together, or a chance to think, whether you could talk on that.
Information by itself is not going to do it, because without discussion, and we've done some experiments on that, particularly one in New Haven that we did at Yale, people are told the information, they're still going to stick with their views. But if they discuss it in depth with diverse others, and they hear the other point of view, they may well change their view. But it has to be, people are afraid to participate in these because they're afraid of just getting yelled at. But if you guarantee a kind of civil discussion and they process it in the discussions and they can get their further questions answered, I mean, more than 2/3 of the questions we've ever asked in deliberative polls have changed significantly. So I think you do get a lot of change. The most important thing is we not only clarify the change, but we clarify the reasoning behind the change. Because we tape the small group discussions, we have the transcripts, we have other explanatory variables, and so we get a fairly nuanced picture of informed opinion.
Yes, right here.
I would think that there would be tremendous resistance to deliberative polling among certain powerful special interests in the United States. I think, for example, of the fossil fuel industry and the issue of climate change. And how do you overcome that? Because I think what you're doing is terrific. And, but it seems to me that whether it's a political campaign or otherwise, that those with power don't want to get people to understand the issues better.
Well, that could be. Let me mention what happened in Texas, which is very interesting because the years of action by environmental groups got the legislature to pass a requirement. It wasn't a requirement, it was the option that the Public Utility Commission could require public consultation. So the major utilities then said, once it was required, they said, what's this? The public doesn't understand the complexities of this stuff, and hundreds of millions of dollars will turn on what decisions are recommended. So they said, we better do this the best way possible. We can't do polls because the public doesn't have the information. If we do focus groups, they're too small to be representative. If we have open meetings, we'll just get lobbyists. So they turned to us and we did these deliberative polls, and we got, once they were happening, all the key players, including the fossil fuel industry and the advocates of coal, natural gas, as well as renewable energy and conservation, and the advocates of consumers, all had to take part because they didn't want to be left out. As we said, the train is leaving the station. Are you going to be on it? I mean, is your view the current Prime Minister of Australia, Malcolm Turnbull, was the leader of the Republic movement at the time that we did the national deliberative poll on the Republic, and he was saying, oh, we're not sure we want to be involved. And I said to him, the train is leaving the station. Are you going to be on it? And we had the Australian Broadcasting Corporation that was going to broadcast it that did broadcast it from the old Parliament House. He jumped on the train and participated, and there's a wonderful discussion of it in his book. So even though he was initially skeptical, so if there's a decision, if this is going to be part of a decision process, or if it's going to be televised, people then, or if it's going to be consequential in some way for the public dialogue, people have to calculate, are they going to be in or are they going to be out? You're right, sometimes they may not. But when we did Northern Ireland, we got all the representatives of the different kinds of schools, Protestants and Catholic, to participate, even though some of them kept us waiting until 5 minutes before the event started. They all showed up.
Over here. Yes. Thanks.
Your ideas are very appealing, and I'm wondering if the original intention of the Internet was something like this, but then there was this transition to make the Internet commercial, and now all we have is a vehicle for advertising. And so would the purpose that people use the Internet for today have to change to be more open to new information and more direct participation in politics, not just consumerism?
Well, you're absolutely right that the initial, I don't know about the purpose, the original vision of the Internet was quite utopian, and it has not lived up to that. And my collaborator, Bruce Ackerman at Yale, even wrote in a book using science fiction called Social Justice in the Liberal State. He envisaged something like the Internet, but it was all used to promote the public dialogue. Anybody could send a message to anybody else, and he did not think about, not a criticism of him because I think he's quite brilliant, but he didn't think about spam, and he didn't think about fake news, and he didn't think about all the efforts to distort our. When we're all given these additional capacities which we can exercise with freedom, what's happening is some people are misusing it. And the other problem is, the whole liberal project, as traced out in John Stuart Mill's On Liberty, is that liberty will lead to exposure to diversity, which will lead to what he called individuality, which was people thinking for themselves. And suppose more liberty leads to people not choosing to expose themselves to diversity, but to sameness. And then we're all in our own bubble, and we don't get any individuality because we never even hear the other side. But in the deliberative poll, people hear the other side. And if we could scale it, they would also hear the other side. That's why I say we would use social media to stream diverse others into the same small groups. But to recreate the same experience that we have at the micro level in the deliberative poll.
So I think we are actually running pretty short on time, so we're going to take one last question. Maybe someone from back up there. Yes.
I would like to get back to the United States. We have an exceptionalism for Americans, which undoubtedly is based on our Constitution. Yet at this moment, all our deliberative bodies are represented by minorities. The Senate, the two senators from Texas have the same vote as the two senators from Montana or Rhode Island. In the House of Representatives, through gerrymandering, we can get a minority to vote a majority. In the case of the presidency, we have the Electoral College, where numbers are given to each state so that it's possible to become a president by having the minority vote for us. And through a questionable maneuver, the Supreme Court is also controlled by a minority, was voted in by a minority. So with all of this, how can we change the system that it's equal and that when the deliberative bodies are voted in, that a majority of the people are heard
Thank you.
that their agenda is being respected?
Great. Thank you.
I agree with you about the list of ills in the current American system. One of my great frustrations is that my colleague, Larry Diamond, who and I, he's an expert on democracy, and he had to cover my class Wednesday so that I could fly up here for this symposium. But he and I have have a proposal to do a national deliberation. We called it What's Next America, and our list of infirmities in the American political system was very much like the one you offer, except we didn't propose changing the Constitution of the Senate, but the Electoral College was included. But a lot of issues about voting rights, as well as campaign finance, and maybe ranked choice voting, various kinds of reforms, and we just about had it funded, because we've done a number of nationally broadcast PBS projects, although the most recent one was just a California project, but we've done a number of them over the years. And with our PBS partners, we just about had it funded, and it was going to be confirmed after the election. But after the election, none of the foundations really wanted to talk to us anymore, because they were just so surprised by the result. And I kept saying, long-term political reforms in the U.S. need to be addressed, and it's not an issue for technocrats. The people have to be consulted. We have to understand what the people would support and why, and which reforms they would not. So he and I are just still in this situation. So we probably still have about half the money, but if you know somebody who wants to fund the other half, let me know, because I think there should be a national conversation about political reform, and we have the means to do it in a representative and thoughtful way and to amplify it. So I make to Americans the same proposition that I made in Le Monde to President Macron. If you want a European-wide conversation, talk to us and our European collaborators. But I think we need an American conversation urgently.
Thank you.